So let's start then. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining today's forum, which is titled ESG Management Theory and Practice. Today's event is sponsored by the Asian Institute of Corporate Governance, or AICG, and the KUBS SK Social Value Education Program at Korea University Business School. Now, as announced before, we have Professor Alex Edmans from the London Business School and three panelists from Korea University Business School discussing on the issues on ESG management, which is one of the hottest topic in both practice and academia fields these days. We all are looking forward very informative and the insightful presentation and discussion of this topic today. Now, before we start, the director of AICG, the Professor Kyung-Soo Park at Korea University Business School, will give the welcoming remark. Professor Park.
Okay, thank you. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome all the online participants of the seminar. ESG management, which is the topic of the day, has become such an important issue in corporate business today, so that companies cannot survive the coming era without properly dealing with the ESG related issues of their firms. Today, we have excellent speaker, Professor Edmans of London Business School, and he has taught at the Wharton School of the Business at the University of Pennsylvania after finishing his study at the Sloan School of Management in 2007. His main research area is corporate finance, also corporate governance, and he has published many papers in top-tier journals, including American Economic Review, Journal of Finance, and Journal of Financial Economics, among others. He recently published a paper, Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, which was selected as the best books of 2020 by Financial Times. He has many academic honors too, such as the Rising Star in Finance and Rising Star in Corporate Governance. Now, please welcome Professor Edmans. Professor, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Professor Parker. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much to the AICG and the KUBS for putting this on. And thank you to everybody for joining. So I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes about my new book and about why responsibility is key for business. So I think for many, many years, ESG had been seen as an optional extra, as perhaps a luxury. But I'm arguing that this is something which is central to business. And I come at this topic as a professor of finance. I'm not a professor of social responsibility or ethical business, but from a financial perspective, I believe that responsibility is something that we should be taking very seriously. And to do this, let me start by giving you a case study or a story. So I'd like to take you halfway around the world, at least metaphorically. I'd like to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers, from Lebanon in Asia to Mozambique in Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, like this one, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, you might think it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before. But in fact, some of you might have seen it before, not on the small screen of your home laptop, but maybe on the big screen of a movie theater. It was featured in The Constant Gardener, a blockbuster that came out 15 years ago. And indeed, millions of people around the world have seen this lake because they've seen this movie. But fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Soronga, and he makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. So when he sold a goat, he would receive cash, but then he'd have to store that cash and worry about it being stolen. And he also had to check that it wasn't forged to begin with. And then to bank that cash, he had to walk for an entire day to the nearest bank. So his life was really tough. He couldn't graze his goats in the greenest pastures. He always had to be within 1 day of a bank. But all of that changed due to what I would view as a responsible business. And this responsible business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Because in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. Now, let me briefly explain what mobile money is, because some people think it's mobile banking, right? I have a bank account and I can operate it on my phone. I don't need to go down to the branch. But in fact, with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account to begin with. And that's really powerful because at the time, 15 million Kenyans did not have access to the banking system. So this completely transformed Emmanuel's life. He no longer needs to worry about robbery or forgery. He can graze his goats where he wants to. He doesn't always need to be within one day of a bank. He doesn't need to deal with cash anymore. Everything he gets is electronically on his phone. But we're here at Career University. We're here as academics. And as academics, we care not about stories, we care about research. And indeed, a great paper published by some MIT professors found that it wasn't just this one story, but 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty due to M-Pesa. And many of these households were headed by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a big effect on gender parity. So that is one story I'm going to tell you about Vodafone. But I now want to tell you a different story. And this different story surrounds tax. Because in 2012, Vodafone was the first company around the world in telecoms to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they're paying to governments worldwide, 11 billion. And obviously, fair tax is really important in telecoms because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax jurisdictions. So I've got two questions for everybody here to think about. Which of these decisions, launching M-Pesa or tax transparency, created most value for society? And the second is, which of these decisions, if it had not been taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's ESG rating or reputation? I'm not going to poll anybody here. We're going to have a great discussion later with the distinguished panel. But why I'm not going to poll anybody is most people agree with the answers. Like, which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. Right, by launching M-Pesa, Vodafone lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed to gender parity. But let's now turn to the second question. What would have been the outrage if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. Right, you don't get slammed by the media for not launching an innovation. There would have never been a customer boycott for not coming up with this idea of banking without a bank, because nobody would have expected you to do that. But what is the outrage of not being transparent on tax? It could be massive. And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of their stores 2 years earlier. So what is the point of me starting with these two examples? It's to change our thinking on what ESG is about. So ESG is a really hot topic in Korea. It's something that people have been taking really seriously for many years now. But I want to present a new view on this already established topic. Often people think that ESG is about the answer to the second question. Like, good ESG involves doing no harm. Like, we don't cheat on taxes, we don't pollute the environment, and we don't mistreat our workers. Like, it's often seen as being good risk management. And don't get me wrong, like, it's really important for companies not to mistreat workers or pollute the environment. But I want to shift our thinking about ESG and to say it's much more about the answer to the first question. ESG is about actively doing good, actively creating value. Right, so why do I think this is what we should view ESG as? For two reasons. The first is the moral reason. Well, ethically, I don't think it's enough for businesses in 2021 to just do no harm. Right, given the scale of the challenges the world faces, climate change, automation, pandemics, businesses need to actively do good. But there's also a very strong business and financial case, and that's why I, as a finance professor, am really interested in this topic. And to show you the financial case, let me just go through very briefly the framework in the book that I recently released. So we often think that the value that a company creates is given by a pie. And that pie can be split either in terms of profits to investors, that's the blue, or value to society, and that could be fair wages to workers, taxes to the government, or fair prices to customers. And often we think that responsibility is about splitting the pie more fairly. That is good ESG. And obviously fairness is important, but there's a limitation to seeing ESG about just being a fair split of the pie. There's two challenges with that. The first challenge is that if ESG just means splitting the pie differently, then no CEO would want to do it. Why? Because it makes his or her company less profitable. Indeed, 2 years ago, we saw in the US 181 CEOs sign the Business Roundtable statement claiming that they would serve society, but many of them have not put it into practice. And why would they? Right? If ESG means that you're going to be less profitable, let's not really be serious about doing it. The second reason is that if ESG means splitting the pie differently, it's bad for investors. Now, many people think, I don't care. Like, we like to see investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then that's good for everybody. But investors are not them. They are us. Right? They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds saving for retirement. So any repurposing of business needs to take investors seriously. Right? ESG needs to be supportive of profit because profit plays a key role in a well-functioning society. So this is why my view of ESG is that it's about growing the pie. Well, we absolutely do want to increase the orange. We want to create value for wider society. But the way we do that is not by giving people a greater slice of what's already there, but by innovating, by being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence. And the power of this is that ultimately it might end up being profitable. So if I go back to Vodafone, back in 2007, Vodafone's strategy was to expand in the West and to win license auctions in the West, because that's where the profits were highest. It should have never launched M-Pesa, because why would you want to expand into a developing country where people are less affluent? They won't be able to buy your products. But what ESG allowed them to do was to launch M-Pesa just to alleviate this problem of financial inclusion. And ultimately, that ended up being profitable and they were able to monetize it. But it would have been really difficult to predict those profits from the outset. So this is why I see ESG as being so powerful, because it gives you the opportunity to see business opportunities that you would have otherwise turned down. And so this new view is what I call in the book pie economics. It's the idea that we want to view ESG as growing the pie, not just splitting the pie differently. Now, at this point in my talk, you might think, well, everything else I've said so far sounds great, but where's the evidence? It seems a bit like wishful thinking. Well, I seem to be giving the message that companies should just serve society and magically the profits will appear. But obviously, as a leading business school, we want to make sure that anything we present is based on a lot of rigorous evidence. And so indeed, this is what I've been doing for the past 15 years as a professor, is doing research on this topic. And let me go through one of my own papers, which tries to look at, is a purposeful company actually going to be more profitable? Now, to do this, it's really difficult, right? Because how do we define whether a company is purposeful? You might look at their mission statement, but the problem is that many companies might have some great statements, but not put it into practice. Another approach might be to ask which companies actually put their money where their mouth is. Do they donate a lot of money to charity? Or do they pay their workers a lot? But the problem with that is those measure the input, how much a company spends. It doesn't measure the output, how effective the spending is, right? You could donate your money to a charity that's really ineffective. And in contrast, some of the best things that a company does for society doesn't actually cost you much. So with Vodafone and M-Pesa, that didn't cost Vodafone a lot. It was just the mindset to use their technology to address the problem of financial inclusion. Similarly, a great boss might be somebody who just provides their employees with some training, some exciting work and skill development. That doesn't cost you anything, but it has a huge benefit. So what I wanted to do was to look at the output, not the input. And so what I decided to look at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So that is a measure of a company's employee satisfaction, how well a company treats its workers. Now, you might think, well, why did I look at that? Why didn't I look at the environment? Why did I look at employees? Two reasons. The first reason is one I'm going to come back to later. It's the idea of materiality. Like, climate change is really important, but it only matters in a few sectors. So let's say energy. Whereas employees matter in nearly every company. So this is something which is critical for every business. And the second reason is I had a really good measure available, which was this list. This list was available from 1984. And that's really powerful because it meant I had tons of data. So ESG is obviously really popular in Korea, and it's been popular probably for at least 10 years, but it wasn't so popular perhaps before then. And so many data sources have only been around for around 10 years. And if I showed you that ESG paid off from 2010 to 2019, you might think, well, those are 10 years where the stock market did really well. Maybe ESG only pays off in good times. Maybe in bad times, it doesn't actually pay off. And so the nice thing about having data which started in 1984 is it contained things like the financial crisis, like the collapse of the internet bubble, like September the 11th, and therefore we can make sure that this is something that's robust and rigorous. And obviously there's lots of other tests I need to do to show, is this correlation or is it causation? Does employee satisfaction lead to better performance? Or is it better performance that allows the company to spend on employee satisfaction? And so this took 4 years to complete the study. I was a professor at Wharton at the time, and actually Professor James Park of Korea University, he was a PhD student and provided some amazing research assistance on this project to make sure it was really rigorous. And after doing all that work, what did we find? We found that the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So this is serious business, right? A company that treats its workers well is not just being ethical, it's not just being moral. It's a company which is being financially savvy because it's improving its long-term performance. So my final 10 minutes before I hand over to the panel, let me just talk about how to put this in practice, because I know it's many practitioners are here in the audience. So my message is that companies should think about ESG as growing the pie, creating value, but how do we actually think about creating value for wider society? So I'm going to talk about the idea of purpose, which is a core component of ESG, but it's something that people speak about without clearly defining it. So often people think that purpose is the same as altruism. So companies will have purpose statements like, we are here to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, communities, and investors. Well, that sounds great, but a problem is that it's unrealistic because it doesn't recognize that there are trade-offs. A responsible business can't serve everybody. For example, if you are an energy company and you're shutting down a polluting plant, that's good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. So you can't serve both, you're going to have to prioritize. And indeed, if you think about the word purpose, it doesn't mean altruism, it means focus. Right? A purposeful company is one with a purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I'm going to do it deliberately. So a purposeful company is one that is focused and targeted on a few issues. And so this is one of the main mistakes I think companies make when they try to be purposeful. They think we need to solve every one of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We need to serve everybody. But I don't think that's the case. Purpose is why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. So that needs to be focused on a couple of issues. Just like a person's purpose would not be to be a doctor and a lawyer and a finance professor and an entrepreneur. You choose to be one of those. So let me make this a little bit more concrete. So why do you exist? Right, you could exist to do many, many things. But one of the things I talk about in the book is the idea of comparative advantage, to focus on the few unique problems that your company is well placed to solve. So Vodafone did not contribute towards diversity or climate change, even though those are big problems. Instead, it focused on financial inclusion because it had expertise specifically in telecommunications. And the second thing, the who, this is the idea of materiality that I mentioned previously. Right, you could try and serve everybody, but as I mentioned, that's not realistic. So what do I mean by materiality? This is which of the stakeholders is most important for your business's success. What are the most material, critical business issues for your company? And so that's going to go through the last study I'm going to show you. And this looks at the materiality map, which was devised by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. This goes industry by industry and highlights who are the most material stakeholders within your industry. For example, the first column is mining. And the environment is really important. If you are Rio Tinto and you blow up Juukan Gorge, that's going to be really bad for your business. But if we look at financials, banks and insurance, actually the environment is not so important to you. More important are selling practices and product labeling. Right? We don't want to be, say, Wells Fargo, who opened up a lot of fake bank accounts. So why does materiality matter? So what this study does is it looks at the MSCI data on ESG, which is perhaps the best known data source. And what they do is they find the companies that did really well on every issue, the companies that were ESG leaders. And surprisingly, they find that they don't beat the market. They only beat the market by 1.5%, which is insignificant. But when they redid the study, looking at companies that did well on the material issues, but who scaled back on the immaterial issues, they did beat the market by 4.8%. And so it's worth just pausing to highlight the importance of those results. So this says that actually doing good ESG is not about addressing every ESG problem, but focusing on the material issues and actually scaling back on the ones that are less good. Again, my final 5 minutes, let me talk about ESG in the pandemic. So I wrote the book just before the pandemic. And then when the pandemic happened, people thought, well, is ESG really realistic in the pandemic when companies don't have money? But what I think the pandemic has shown is how powerful it is to view responsibility through this pie-growing pie-economics lens. So there are many companies in the pandemic which have done some great actions that split the pie differently. Right, some CEOs are accepting a zero salary. There are some companies that continue to pay their workers, even though they're furloughed. There's some companies like Unilever, which have given 100 million euros of food and sanitizer. Now, those are great examples, but the problem with viewing responsibility as splitting the pie is that in a pandemic, many companies can't split the pie because they don't have money. Like, what if you don't have 100 million euros lying around? Or what if you're not in the food and sanitizer industry? So this highlights the power of viewing ESG as being about growing the pie. So what a responsible business leader should ask himself or herself is, what is in my hand? What are the resources and what is the expertise that my company has? And how can I use this to serve wider society? And so this is really powerful because even companies in unrelated industries can play their part. So there are some perfume companies that have said, well, what is in my hand is my ability to manufacture with alcohol-based products. Let me now use this to make sanitizer. Or you have a company like Mercedes, their expertise is in engineering, and they've now repurposed that engineering expertise to make some breathing machines. But one of the big powers is small businesses, right? Because often we think that only if you're a massive company can you think about responsibility. However, there are some small businesses who've really played their part. So one small business that I'm a customer of is called Barry's Bootcamp. It is a chain of gyms in London. David Beckham goes to this gym. And obviously this gym has been closed in the pandemic. But what is in their hand is the ability to run fitness classes. And what they've done is offered free online fitness classes, which is really important because many people can't go to the gym because of the lockdown. And that doesn't cost them anything, right? So even a small business is able to do that. But here's the beautiful thing. What if you are a receptionist in the gym? The gym is closed, so you're not sure what you can do. But it turns out that many of these receptionists are actors as their main job. And if you're an actor, your income is volatile. So that's why they took this reception job to give them some income stability. Now, if you're an actor, what is in your hand? Well, you're really funny. But how does that help out in the pandemic? Well, we had a lot of working parents where the schools were shut, and so the children were at home. And so what they did is they offered things like Zoom storytelling sessions to take the load off their working parents. Now, that might seem a small thing, but it made a massive difference. And so if there's ever any small silver lining to the pandemic, it's about how we should change our view about responsibility. It's not about spending money. It's not about doing harm. Instead, it's about actively doing good, thinking about what we can do with the resources that we have to create value for wider society. And so just before I hand over the panel, this is why I wrote the book 1.5 years ago. Right? I think for far too long, people just saw ESG as being about doing no harm. It's something that only had a moral case. And if the case is only a moral case, then it always will be secondary to any company or any investor. So what I wanted to highlight is that responsibility is about actively doing good. That's not only good for society, it's also good for business. And this is based on a lot of academic research, but often academic research can be written in a very sort of boring and academic way. So I wanted to make this alive for a practitioner audience. So it came out in the UK 1.5 years ago, and I'm really proud that the first foreign translation is in Korean. It's being translated into many other languages, but I really care about this. My wife is Korean. My father-in-law helped to translate the book with some professors, and so I'm really proud that this is come out in Korean, and I'm really grateful that Korea University Business School is the first university that I'm speaking at after the launch of the Korean edition. So let me just pause here. Thank you so much for your attention, and let me hand over to the distinguished panel for their comments and questions before some questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the great and insightful presentation, Professor Edmans. I believe this presentation gave us a lot of things to think about this ESG management as a whole, and also the pie economics introduced by the Professor Edmans. Now, today we have three panelists here: the Professor Jung-bin Moon, and Professor Woo-chan Kim, and Professor Hyun-sung Na. They're all the experts in this field, and all from the Korea University Business School. So first of all, I would like to ask our panelists to address their general opinions on ESG management, and especially on the Pie Economics, introduced by the Professor Edmans. So let's start with the Professor Kim.
Okay, there are many reasons why I like this book, but if someone asks me to just pick two reasons why I like it, I would have to say that the chapter where he talks about the limitations of the instrumental view. The second one is the three principles that he proposed, namely the principle of multiplication, comparative advantage, and materiality. On the first part, he talks about the limitation of the instrumental stakeholderism against the intrinsic view. The basic concept is called the error of omission. He didn't talk about this in the presentation today, but a very important concept is the error of omission, basically saying that if you solely base upon your NPV calculation to decide where to invest, well, you're going to miss a lot because there are lots of intangible benefits that can create value, and you're going to drop many of the projects, and that will not help you to grow the pie or please the shareholders. So that's the one I like about. And the second one is the three principles. Because I think that if you really follow these principles, you can reduce the agency problem, the problem that we often talk about when people talk about ESG, can be reduced. But however, on the second point, my question is, these three principles, especially comparative advantage and materiality, which is the essence of running the company with a purpose, there doesn't seem to be any mechanism that will impose these three principles upon the managers. And also, there doesn't seem to be much of an incentive for the managers to actually follow these principles. This is particularly worrisome in case of Korea, where we have a powerful chaebol families that enjoy private benefit of control, and they actually want to prolong this permanently. And my worry is that maybe they will use this opportunity as a good excuse to campaign for the legalization of, for example, dual class shares or poison pill in the name of protecting their long-term commitment to a social cause. So I would like to hear Professor Edmans on this point and enlighten us. So that's my comment.
Okay, thank you very much. And Professor Na?
Okay, so I also basically agree with pie economics, which argues that by creating social value and growing the pie, companies can also create long-term profits or values for stockholders as well. Actually, this is an inspiring argument, and I also like the idea that companies need to actively create social value by doing well in their core business instead of decreasing problems from their business. And also, I like three principles of judgment, which would be quite useful or helpful for companies pursuing this pie economics. However, I also have some concerns raised as well. So even though we plan something with very good intentions, the actual outcome can be quite different from what we expected before if we do not fully or carefully consider the incentives of people or economic parties related. So we need to keep in mind that there are various types of economic parties with different incentives around companies, and implementing pie economics can provide more chances for those economic parties to pursue their own goals or their own benefits. And this concern would be probably higher in some countries with lower investor protection or poor corporate governance, such as Korea. And so the first example of those economic parties with strong incentives would be controlling shareholders or owner measures. And they are actually very powerful in Korea. And so owner measures with selfish incentives can say that they will increase social value, but actually they will increase their own benefits at the expense of other minority shareholders or other stakeholders. So, for example, owner measures or their family members try to build up their own reputation
or political connections by ESG investments or by pie economics instead of truly benefiting stakeholders. So that would be one example. Or sometimes there can be some strong stakeholders as well. So they can intervene the company's management and pursuing pie economics can increase the likelihood of such intervention. So for example, the government will be one of the strong stakeholders. And actually, Korean government is quite influential over many companies in Korea. So I'm concerned about the possibility that the government takes advantage of companies' ESG investments to increase its intervention, decreasing the independence of Korean companies. And this will be in particular the case for firms without controlling shareholders or large ownership. So I basically agree with your pie economics. But I also add that some cautions would be needed in implementing pie economics.
Thank you very much. Professor Moon?
As the only non-finance scholar on the panel, I would like to take a slightly different angle. I would absolutely love reading your book, and today's lecture was also very illuminating. I totally agree that managers and investors should have a much more proactive vision, purpose than what the enlightened shareholder value perspective would suggest. But there's a long tradition in the related business field, like strategy and business ethics, about this stream of ideas. To take a few examples, Caroline Flemmer, who you have cited extensively in your book, Yanis Yauniu of London Business School, and Michael Porter, who proposed creating shared value framework about 10 years ago. And his idea would certainly go much beyond enlightened shareholder value framework. So I would be curious to know how your framework of pie economics and purposeful business is different or improved compared to the existing discussions in sustainability, in strategy and business ethics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your opinion on this ESG management and especially on this pie economics. And apparently our panels have some, they agree with a lot of things with this pie economics story argued by the Professor Edmans. And at the same time, apparently they also have some concerns and questions. So if I may summarize their questions a little bit, then it seems like Professor Kim and Professor Na, they both expressed some concerns on the potential agency problems. So for instance, let's say the selfish managers or the controlling shareholders can exploit their decision-making authorities or power to benefit themselves at the expense of others, arguing that this is necessary for the ESG investment. So that was one thing. And the Professor Kim also worries that although the three principles introduced by the Professor Edmans can reduce some of this problem, but clearly it seems like there is no mechanism to enforce these managers to take these three principles. So, and also the Professor Moon, lastly, he asked that, given the substantial discussion of this ESG management related issues in different fields like strategy area, he was asking, how your pie economic story is different or better than the more traditional argument in this related area. So, Professor Edmans, could you share your thoughts on these issues here?
Absolutely, Professor Kim. Thank you very much for the summary. And thank you to the three professors for their comments and their insights. These are really, really important questions, and I'm grateful for the chance to discuss them. So the first issue, one which both Professor Kim and Professor Na mentioned, was the idea of agency problems. And I think this is really important because there's many people who are advocates of responsible business, and they argue that managers should be protected from shareholders. So they say that the only way to implement responsibility is if you stop shareholders from intervening, because they are arguing that shareholders are very short-termist. Instead, we need things like dual-class shares and poison pills bills in order to protect managers from shareholders. So what we see in the UK and the US is many attempts to change directors' duties to make directors no longer responsible for shareholders. And I think this is completely wrong. So I can fully agree with the concerns of Professors Kim and Professor Na, is that we absolutely need shareholder oversight, because otherwise there will be a lot of agency problems, right? People can pursue responsibility for political reasons, to make themselves sort of more famous and to prove their image, not to improve shareholder value. So one of the unique things about my book, in contrast to a lot of other views on ESG, is a really important role for shareholder oversight. Chapter 6 and chapter 9 in the book, in particular, stress the importance of shareholders and shareholder power, because otherwise there will be no accountability. So absolutely, I think this is really important. One of the things that I did between the UK version and the Korean version is that new evidence came to light, new research on the importance of shareholder oversight, and actually I added that into the book. So some of that is now into the Korean version. So first, as I fully agree that we do need to have good corporate governance, I think that the way that the UK and the US is going is really backward and will backfire, because we need to have accountability. The second thing was the question that Professor Kim raised, which is whose incentive is it to ensure that the principles are followed? Who is to hold you into account? So what I'd say is it's actually in the manager's own interest to do this, is that it's not clear that we need legislation or some enforcement mechanism. Why? Because the evidence of the book shows that it's actually in your interest to follow the principles of materiality, because that leads to long-term profits. Similarly, there's new evidence, which I published before, that I put into the Korean version on the principle of comparative advantage. Again, it's in your interest to follow those principles. And these are also things that external people, perhaps like minority shareholders, can look at. But if a company is pursuing responsibility, but in a way which is not linked to materiality or comparative advantage, then that can be a sign that you should either try to engage, or if that's not possible because you have a minority, perhaps to sell out of those companies. So the nice thing about having principles rather than calculations is those are things for outsiders to assess, for which you don't need a huge amount of inside information. You can just think about, is what the company doing consistent with materiality and comparative advantage? One other thing that Professor Na raised is the government using Korean companies as being sort of vehicles of public policy. And I do think that's also a really important concern. So the role of government here is to make sure that if they want to achieve social values, they should use the traditional government mechanisms of taxes and spending, rather than get companies to pursue public policy initiatives. So that's something I highlighted in a recent article called "What Stakeholder Capitalism Can Learn from Milton Friedman." Often people think that Milton Friedman's idea that businesses should focus on profits is a really backward and narrow idea. And even though I believe in responsibility, not just profits, I do believe there was quite a lot of interesting stuff in Friedman's article. In particular, government should focus to use their own tools, let's say taxes and spending, to address social issues, not distort a company's objectives. Final question from Professor Moon is, he quite rightly highlights that there's a lot of research on this outside of finance. And indeed, this is why I think it's a really interesting topic, is that there are lots of insights to be brought to bear here. And I've tried to capture that in the book. As Professor Moon mentioned, I use the work of Professor Flammer, Professor Ianu, and a lot of other people who've worked in areas other than finance. Michael Porter indeed did the idea of shared value way before me. So what are the differences? I'd say there are several important ones. One of them is the empirical backing, right? So Michael Porter said, oh yes, we should create shared value. But there's many business leaders who think, well, that sounds just unrealistic. How can we benefit both shareholders and society? Is this actually possible? And so a lot of the evidence that I bring to bear suggests that this is something which is achievable. But also the evidence is nuanced. Not everything creates shareholder value. You need to follow the principles such as materiality and comparative advantage. And that's linked to the idea of the decision-making framework, which I'm really grateful for Professor Kim and Professor Na for highlighting. Like, those principles are ones that guide managers into knowing what creates shared value and which does not. Whereas the general idea of Porter of creating shared value, that was rather general and wasn't sort of highlighting to managers and investors what are the things that actually do create shared value and which do not. So I agree that there are a number of intellectual antecedents, but I think the book goes beyond that with its evidential backing and also its practical decision-making framework.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who wants to add some more on what the Professor Edmans just talked about? No? All right. Good. Now, these days, the ES management became, a very important issue in Korea also. So the Korean government is pushing very hard, and investors in the market, everybody is trying to look at the ESG performance. So the Korean companies especially are under great pressure to do something about this ESG management. And, unfortunately, many of them actually do not know what to do. So one of the important issues the companies are facing, especially in Korea, is related to the implementation or the enforcement of the ESG management, and also the evaluation of the ESG performance. So now I'd like to ask our panelists to address their thoughts on these issues here. So let's start with the Professor Na this time.
Okay, so to implement pie economics, I think one issue is that it is difficult to quantify the benefits of pie economics. In his book, Professor Edmans mentions that how much social value is created cannot be calculated. So we have to rely on manager judgment on those issues. Then a question here is how we can evaluate the managerial judgment on ESG investment. Given that it is hard to quantify the benefits of pie economics. Professor Edmans provides 3 principles of judgment, which I really like. However, things would be probably more complicated or subtle in practice. So there would be some remaining issues in here. And another related issue is how we can monitor managerial decisions on ESG investments. So pie economics can increase the long-term value for stockholders, but it can also decrease the short-term profit for stockholders. So it can increase the risk levels of companies pursuing ESG investments or pie economics. So maybe we need somebody who closely monitor their ESG decisions or pie economics decisions. But monitoring ESG investment would be quite difficult because quantifying the benefits of pie economics would be quite difficult or actually impossible. So also there is some high information asymmetry for those types of decisions. So board of directors can probably be monitoring those decisions. And actually there are many ESG committees in the boards of many Korean companies nowadays, but I'm not sure whether those committees will be really working well for the purpose, because board of directors will be representatives of shareholders, not those of stakeholders. So there is some issue here. And also maybe monitoring by outsiders will be also quite tricky because of high information asymmetry between insiders and outsiders for these types of decisions. So I think here we have some issues we need to think about.
Thank you very much. So Professor Moon.
Right. I have a question about the measurement of ESG by global standard ESG rating agencies. So there's a difference between E and S and G, in my view, because environmental norms can be universal and it can be called a hypernorm, following Tom Donaldson and Thomas Dunphy of Wharton School, because environmental norms can be applied universally. If you reduce emission of 1 ton of CO2, that is the same regardless of where you do it, right? But for social and governance issues, there are many country-specific institutional factors that can affect these corporate behaviors and how these practices are evaluated. My panelists told many examples in Korea, right? There's a modified version of principal agent problem among chaebol corporations. And there's an asymmetry between founding family shareholders and other minority shareholders, where founding family shareholders can take advantage of smaller shareholders. And despite these problems, some of Korean chaebol corporations can score very highly in a global standard ESG rating because they fit the Anglo-American framework of corporate governance pretty well. Regarding social issues, there are many areas: labor relation, diversity, product safety, supplier relations. And scholars like Maten and Moon, they compared the explicit CSR approach of Anglo-American corporations versus implicit CSR approach in continental European corporations. And if you look at the MSCI ESG database that you cited, American firms and British firms are kind of overrepresented, while continental European, Japanese, and Korean firms are kind of underrepresented, showing a little bit of Anglo-American bias in my view. So given these challenges, can a global ESG ratings firm measure ESG performance originating from countries with very, very different institutional and cultural backgrounds fairly and effectively? Is there any bias built into a standard ESG ratings method? And if there is, how can we improve the measurement of ESG in light of these diversity? That's my question.
Thank you. Professor Kim?
Okay, I would like to make just 2 points. One is whether there can be any unintended consequences of running the business with a purpose. According to Professor Edmans, having a purpose means that there is this particular stakeholder, the stakeholder that is most material. You have to focus on this stakeholder, and that is how you can actually grow the pie and please the shareholders. This means that this one particular stakeholder that the company cares about is going to be on top of other stakeholders. And the side effect could be that although the company is benefiting this material stakeholder, but that could be at the expense of other stakeholders. One example can be, I may be wrong, if you take an example of Amazon, if you search for their vision, it says, we want to be the Earth's most customer-centered company. So let me read this again. The customer-centered company. So they're very clear about who they care about. Their material stakeholder is a customer. And I agree that they have done a wonderful job. We all enjoy consumer surplus. They benefited us a lot. They did a great job. But during the pandemic years, we know that many of the warehouse workers, they suffered under very poor working conditions. And this is not only the case for Amazon, but similar companies around the world. And we have a Korean version of Amazon as well. So what I'm trying to say is, if you set the purpose very wide, you will lose the focus. You will not be able to grow the pie. Shareholders will suffer. But if you're too focused, maybe you are actually bringing about higher firm value for the shareholders at the expense of some particular stakeholder. So I think there can be some dilemma here. Another point I want to make is I wonder why there are not many companies that are following this purposeful management. If it is the case that purposeful management will bring about greater size of the pie and even please shareholders, I would expect to see more companies running the company in the way Professor Edmans is telling us. I can think of 3 reasons. One is that maybe the shareholders still wield too much power. They do not allow the managers to take on projects that are not financially accountable. The second one is maybe my assumption is that being purposeful still needs some degree of altruism. So maybe they lack altruism. Maybe they're too selfish to pursue a certain social goal in a very intrinsic, truthful way. And the third reason, I think, is the most important reason, is they probably haven't still read Professor Edmans' book, Grow the Pie. So they should read this book and they should be inspired. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It seems like, I can summarize the questions from the panels into three folds. One is related to the measurement issue. The Professor Nye and Professor Moon mentioned some potential problems and difficulties related to this measurement. And the Professor Kim actually raised 2 points. One is the case of unintended consequences from being purposeful. And the other is, if it's this much great, then why don't we see many companies are doing the same things. So Professor Edmans, could you share your thoughts on these issues here?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Professor Kim, for that summary. And thank you again to the panel for raising a really interesting and important set of issues. So I think the measurement issue is really key. So the big question is, well, how do we actually ensure that these companies are growing the pie and creating value? And I think what I'm trying to highlight in the book is that while metrics such as MSCI ESG ratings are good, they are incomplete. So they focus only on quantitative dimensions, not qualitative dimensions. So you can measure, for example, the number of new jobs created or how much you're paying your employees, but you're not able to measure qualitative dimensions such as meaningful work and skills development and corporate culture. And indeed, what I did on the book's website was when there was new research coming out on this topic that wasn't in the original book, then I will try to write about it. And I've tried to do this in other forms as well. So what I'm putting here in the chat is an article I wrote called The Dangers of Sustainability Metrics, that we can't rely too much on these ESG ratings. And part of the reason, as Professor Moon highlighted, is that there's inconsistency. While people can agree on the E, with the social, there are different views. And I've also got an article here called The Inconsistency of ESG Ratings on my website. So what does this mean? We should still use these ratings, but those ratings should only be one input into a decision-making process. We shouldn't invest in the company, I think, as a responsible investor, without meeting the company and speaking to management. It's a bit like hiring a person for your company. Like, we can now probably have artificial intelligence scanning your social media. We can probably give you some psychometric tests, but unless we actually interview you, it's not possible to put this data into context. And similarly, just taking these ESG ratings off the shelf without understanding why you high on this and low on this, that's something which I think is particularly short-sighted. So I've talked to a lot of investors, including investors outside the UK and US, and really what they find to be the most important thing is boots on the ground investing. So speaking to management. So there's one large investor in mainly emerging markets who won't invest in any company unless they meet the management. And sometimes they will ask the CEO loads of questions. The CEO will answer nearly every question. And then it comes to the ESG question. And then the CEO says, yeah, ESG is really important. Let me have the investor relations person answer this question. And that just shows that the CEO doesn't really believe ESG to be important. It's purely an investor relations PR question rather than something which is serious. So one thing I have done in the book in chapter 8 was developed a set of qualitative questions that investors can ask companies and which are actually quite discerning questions. So many investors fed into this process of me designing the questions, they view it as useful. And so the information asymmetry, which the panel highlighted, that's something that these questions aim to address. And so that aims to try to get some information which goes beyond just the numbers. I also serve on the investment committee of a global asset manager, which invests in many frontier and emerging markets and also some developed markets outside the UK and US. And one thing we always try to ensure is we don't have the bias towards UK and US standards, which is correctly highlighted. For example, we need to recognize that different countries have different social issues. So if you are in a country where maybe, standards of nutrition are relatively low, then we don't care so much about animal welfare standards. So there was a pork producer we looked at, where in this country, because protein consumption is quite low, what we are more concerned about is making protein consumption more affordable and safe, rather than the animal welfare standards of the UK and US. Yes, we do care about animal welfare, but even more material in this country was protein content and the ability to feed the population. Then to Professor Kim's questions, you do raise the really important idea of nuance. So while I say that there should be focus, right, there should also be some sort of, it should never be exclusive focus. So while some stakeholders might be the most material, it does not mean prioritizing them in every decision. So out of the research papers that I write, there might be some that are more important to me. So anything on ESG is more important to me than sort of a pure theory paper, but I'm still not going to neglect those other papers, right? You are first among equals, but it does mean in many circumstances actually looking at the other things and juggling all of these different things that you need to balance. And then finally, really like your suggestion for why companies are not doing it. And well, obviously part of it was yes, I would love people to write the book, read the book. But why I did that is to highlight that actually it's in your interest to be purposeful. So I think there's many CEOs who still think about this as being a public relations exercise, something they sort of have to do in order to avoid some fine or some scandal, but they don't really fully understand, well, there is a true business case for this. And actually, it's not so daunting to be purposeful. So there's some leaders who I've spoken to who said, well, if I'm a purposeful business, I need to address all 17 of the SDGs, and that I can't do, so I would end up being a hypocrite. But what I'm trying to stress is actually being purposeful does mean being focused. And so you don't need to address all of the world's problems. Indeed, many of the companies that I've given talks to about the book are companies that you don't think would naturally embrace purpose, like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or KKR or private equity firms or law firms, but they do like this idea of purpose actually being not just something which is nice, but something which is successful and also effective.
Thank you very much. So anyone who wants to add anything here? Nope. Professor Kim?
Just it's not a serious comment. I just want to say that you should seriously think about visiting Korea and actually meeting the company managers and trying to convince them that this is in their own interest to run the business with a purpose. Not just giving a talk from London, you should actually visit us.
Well, thank you, Professor Kim. I would love to do that, and I'd love to come in person and meet. And I'm happy for people to company management to object and to express their concerns. So this is why I've liked going into the KKRs and the Goldman Sachs of the world and say, please tell me all of the reasons why you think what I'm saying is unrealistic. And I'm really happy to have those conversations. So hopefully when the pandemic is over, I'll come out to Korea and have those conversations. So thank you very much. And if you obviously have those contacts with companies who are willing to do that, I'd love to be connected with the companies that you think would find this a meaningful conversation.
All right, thank you. So given our time constraint we have here, I'm not sure whether we have time to address the questions from the online, but
Well, I don't see any questions in the chatting box.
oh, okay. So
If you may I ask a question?
Sure.
So to be consistent with the purpose of the companies, now focusing on ESG, should we see any change in the governance structure? For example, the board of directors in Germany, they have these representatives of the labor unions or employees on their board. And that sounds like more like a scheme consistent with the stakeholder capitalism of the European continental companies. So do you see the necessity of the change in the board structure or the overall governance structure to be more consistent with your ESG argument?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. So how should we change governance structures? And I think the way that any academic likes to answer these questions is with evidence and research. And so there's a lot of claims that we should have workers on boards, but I don't think they're actually supported by evidence. And indeed, what I'm going to share is another thing, a really nice article written by one of my colleagues at LBS on the evidence for workers on boards. And it's actually much more nuanced than one might think. And one of the main concerns here is that workers are only one part of the pie. And when workers have primacy, then maybe you have the problem that Professor Kim highlighted, is that if one stakeholder is most important than the others, then they're going to make the decisions in their own interest. So it may be that workers will oppose closing down a polluting plant just because they're concerned about jobs, not about the environment. Within the UK, we introduced the night underground, which is really important because it allows people to get to jobs and it leads to greater safety, less drunk driving and so on. But it was workers who objected to this because they didn't want to work late hours and so on. So I think the challenge with having workers on the board is workers might look out for their own interests, not for others' interests. So I do like the current regime of shareholder primacy. Why? Because shareholders in the long term are ultimately affected by what affects all of the other stakeholders. So they are the residual claimant who takes into account the impacts on the other stakeholders. So I don't think we need a shift away from shareholder primacy, even though this idea of workers on board seems like electorally popular, it doesn't seem to be so supported by the evidence.
Thank you. It seems like there is one question from online. So,
Oh, yeah.
Professor Edmans, can you read the question by yourself or?
I can, yes. And I'm not sure whether everybody else can, but let me just try and read it out. So ESG evaluation agencies, so I think the person is referring to rating agencies, focus on evaluation indicators, but there are many problems. I wonder whether you can ever have a perfect measure. And this is a really important question. I'd refer people to my earlier article. Let me just post that one again, because I know I've posted many things. And so, yes, there is indeed a lot of concerns here is that, well, can you measure this properly? There's a lot of subjectivity. And I don't think you can, because inherently social performance will be subjective. Different people have different value systems, as indeed Professor Kim mentioned earlier. Some people might view diversity as more important, others might view innovation as being more important. We have different views. So there are people who go too far the other extreme and say, well, given that ESG ratings disagree with each other, they're completely useless. And I would say they're not, because another word for disagreement is diversity of viewpoint. I like the fact that I can read different ESG ratings reports and see why they differ. I'm a journal editor. Sometimes I will have multiple referee reports. They disagree. Does that mean they're wrong? No, they're just going to look at different perspectives. And my role as an editor is to weigh up those different perspectives. So I think what an investor should do is not just focus on one report and because it says high ESG, just buy a company, but to read the reports and see the dimensions in which they disagree. Now, there are some investors who wish you had the proper measurement that the question is asking about, if there was one perfect measure of ESG. But the problem is that if there was a perfect measure, it would be priced into the market. Well, if there was a perfect measure of ESG that everybody agreed on, then it would be priced in. So as an investor, you won't be able to make money trading on it. So I think the fact that it is really difficult to measure ESG, that quantitative measures are not sufficient for all of the reasons the panel mentioned, makes ESG a really interesting area for investors to get involved in, because it's something which is unlikely to be priced in, because many other investors don't have the sophistication and the nuance and the qualitative dimensions in order to try to properly evaluate ESG performance.
Thank you very much. It seems like, given the time constraint we have, unfortunately, our time's over now. So we will have to end today's discussion. But, before we end, I would like to ask Professor Park to give us some closing remarks.
Okay. I think you have done perfect job. And Professor Edmans, thank you again for your excellent presentation and the talks. I think it was very informative. I learned a lot. Also learned from all the comments by my colleagues. And I say this is the end of our session. Thank you. See you again in Seoul.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much to the Asian Institute for Corporate Governance and Korea University Business School. Thank you so much for all the professors who read the book and came up with some great questions to challenge me within the panel. And I really look forward to doing this in person. So once the world is back to normal, this is not a perfunctory comment. I'd love to come to Korea and meet you in person. And thanks so much for your interest in hosting me. Thank you to everybody also for joining. I know there's a lot going on in the world, so thank you for giving up an hour to hear my views on this topic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.